estamos no ar.
Bom dia, eu gostaria de agradecer a todos os que estão aqui conosco para este webinário da nossa rede Reviget. Inicialmente, eu gostaria de apresentar a doutora Carla Lima, que é a coordenadora do nosso projeto e que vai comigo moderar esta mesa hoje. Doutora Carla, por favor.
Oi, Theolis, bom dia, muito obrigada pela participação de todos, doutor André Habib, doutora Daniela Cirilo, doutor Harold Hoffman, doutora Theolis. Eu agradeço a disponibilidade e presença dos senhores nesse encontro. Gostaria de registrar aqui meu agradecimento especial, doutora Theolis, pela excelente iniciativa e organização nesse evento. O Reviget, ele é uma rede de vigilância genômica da tuberculose que abrange 4 estados no Brasil, na região norte e nordeste. Na região norte, nós temos a participação do estado do Pará e do estado do Amazonas. Na região do nordeste, nós temos a participação do Ceará e da Bahia. E o principal objetivo da rede é capacitar os laboratórios centrais de saúde pública desses estados para que, em médio prazo, a gente possa apoiar de forma mais eficiente a tomada de decisão terapêutica a partir dos ensaios genômicos, e assim contribuindo para o desenvolvimento de abordagens de tratamento personalizado dos pacientes com tuberculose multidroga resistente. A rede foi impulsionada com o financiamento no final de 2023 pelo Ministério da Saúde do Brasil e também com a parceria de algumas instituições muito importantes. Então, eu sou do Instituto Evandro Chagas, a doutora Theolis da Fiocruz. Nós agregamos aí essas instituições, os seus expertises, a sua infraestrutura para impulsionar o Reviget. E nós tivemos apoio também de outras instituições, como a Universidade Federal do Ceará, na pessoa da doutora Cristina Lourenço, o Instituto Nacional de Infectologia, Evandro Chagas, na pessoa da doutora Cristina Lourenço, a Universidade de Stellenbosch foi um parceiro internacional muito importante aqui na pessoa do Dr. Robin Warling e do Dr. Túlio de Oliveira, do SERI, com uma participação muito importante também da doutora Emily Conceição Charma, que fez esse link, é uma paraense que hoje está trabalhando na África do Sul, e também o Dr. Jody Feller, da London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine. E a participação dos senhores aqui é muito importante nesse momento, onde a gente vai ter aí esse compartilhamento da vossa expertise nessa área de medicina de precisão. Então, muito obrigada mais uma vez a todos. Eu passo a palavra para a doutora Theolis.
Obrigada, doutora Carla. Eu gostaria de apresentar o nosso primeiro palestrante, o doutor André Habib, que tem uma vasta experiência em pesquisa translacional no campo da tuberculose. Neste webinário, ele vai compartilhar um pouco dessa experiência conosco, que diz respeito à vigilância genômica e diagnóstico da tuberculose resistente, utilizando métodos genômicos. Ele está atualmente lotado no laboratório supranacional de referência da OMS para a tuberculose na Itália, no Hospital San Raffaele, e vai iniciar, então, esta discussão. Doutor André, muito obrigada por aceitar o nosso convite e pode, por favor, iniciar a sua participação.
Thank you very much, and good afternoon and good morning, everyone. I hope that you can hear well my voice and see my slides in presentation mode. I trust that everything is working. Please let me know if
Yes.
it's not. Yeah. So do you see the slide moving? Yeah. Okay. So again, thanks to the organizer for having invited me to this webinar. I'm very happy to be here, and I want to acknowledge that I prepared the webinar material together with Dr. Cirillo, who is the head of the SRS Supranational Reference Lab in Milan, and with Dr. Arad Offam that will speak after me, and he's the head of the SRL in Gaud in Germany. So my presentation will focus more on what is the added value of next generation sequencing within the TB diagnostics and surveillance cascade. What are the workflows that are available on the use of NGS for M tuberculosis, and what are the performance, costs, limitations, and some of the implementation requirements that are needed for an effective programmatic use of NGS at country level. And then Harald will focus more on the clinical implication reporting and diagnostic algorithms for NGS in the TB laboratories and TB control programs. So starting from the problem, why do we need an advanced tool such as next generation sequencing? Well, we all know that the increase of drug-resistant TB at global level is very concerning. In 2024, we had almost 400,000 cases of MDR and rifampicin-resistant TB. However, less than half of them are officially reported and began treatment properly, with a treatment success rate that is improving, but still it is at 71%. On the positive side, since 2022, we have new treatment options for MDR and RRTB. And in particular, the WHO endorsed the use of BPALM regimen for treating MDR, RRTB, and pre-XDR TB cases. That promises to ensure better outcomes and quality of life with shorter duration of the regimen. So we have the regimens, and now we need to expand access to drug resistance testing, including those drugs that are included in these latest regimens recommended by the WHO. However, if we look at the global numbers, and these are data coming from the Global TB report of the WHO that has been just released a few weeks ago, we see that the number of cases that are tested for rifampicin resistance, as mentioned, is less than half of the total notified cases. You see that the testing coverage for isoniazid resistance, for example, is even lower compared to the rifampicin-resistant testing. And when we move to newer drugs and second-line drugs, here we are seeing the people that are diagnosed with rifampicin resistance. And we see that the testing coverage for fluoroquinolone resistance is still insufficient, around 60%. And when we look at some other new drugs that are included in the MDR regimen, such as bedaquiline and linezolid, you see that testing coverage is extremely poor. And this can also be nicely visualized in these geographic maps, where here on the top corner left, we see that the coverage for rifampicin-resistant testing, although is not complete, is very high. Then when we look at the fluoroquinolone resistance testing among people diagnosed with rifampicin-resistant TB, we have only a coverage of 58%, and the coverage for testing for susceptibility to bedaquiline and linezolid is very low in most parts of the world. So not specific geographic areas, but you see that the coverage is insufficient at global level. we do have several testing options recommended by the WHO. And this is a summary of the rapid tests that are recommended by the WHO. And these are included, recommendations that are included in the latest guidelines from WHO 2025. However, if we look at the coverage by group of class that is used in the therapeutic regimens, we see that, for example, for the coverage of group A drugs in terms of rapid options, the coverage is quite good. We have several tests for testing of fluoroquinolones. But when we look at the bedaquiline or linezolid or clofazimine as a group B drug, we see that we have very important gaps in rapid diagnostic testing for these drugs. And it looks like the genomic technologies are the only approach that can that offer comprehensive and rapid options for DST, of course, beyond the phenotypic DST that is more slow and challenging. So if we look at an example of rapid testing algorithms, when we don't use next generation sequencing in the diagnostic cascade, we see that when we use the rapid test for initial diagnosis, screening of rifampicin resistance, then we move to using follow-on low complexity rapid assays, and then we put patients on treatment while waiting for phenotypic confirmation. We see that we are blinded in assigning the regimens to several second-line drugs that are used when NGS is not included. So what are the main diagnostic gaps that we have in dealing with drug-resistant tuberculosis? If we think to the phenotypic DST, long time to BPAL and second-line drug susceptibility testing, there is also limited access to phenotypic DST for newer drugs, and this is something that we can maybe discuss later. We have some issues and limitations in the management of discordant results because the other rapid assays do not offer comprehensive options for DST. And in terms of epidemiological investigation, we have some gaps in the transmission analysis delays. And here is where next generation sequencing changes the system. And in particular, NGS is being used for microbiology and infectious diseases, for diagnostics, public health purposes, and also for research purposes. The structure of the genome of M. tuberculosis is, I would say, well suitable for genome sequencing analysis. The genome is not super big. There are around 4,000 genes in the M. tuberculosis genomes, and the main mechanism for emergence of drug resistance are chromosomal mutations. So there is no evidence of horizontal gene transfer and transfer of plasmids in M. tuberculosis, and this simplifies, let's say, the investigation of the M. tuberculosis genome. And that's why NGS represents a very good all-in-one test for complete analysis of M. tuberculosis genome, starting from full drug susceptibility testing, and it enables to get faster full DST for drug-resistant TB patients. It enables to inform the use of modern drug-resistant TB regimens, is well suitable for future treatment changes if there are new genes to be screened. And it is a very good tool for supporting drug-resistant survey and surveillance, and also for outbreak analysis and transmission tracking. What workflows do we have available in real tuberculosis labs that can be used for adopting NGS? We can identify two main workflows. One is here on the left, and the second is on the right. On the left, we start from the whole genome sequencing. This provides, of course, a comprehensive analysis of the entire genome of M. tuberculosis, starting from a culture. So after the initial diagnosis, the sample is referred for cultures once the culture is available, and this can take from 1 to 2 to several weeks, and it's a limitation. The DNA can be extracted from positive cultures and submitted for whole genome sequencing analysis. Of course, in terms of data analysis, we will have a complete genome resolutions. We will identify all the mutations that are found in the M. tuberculosis genome, and we can use the data for transmission analysis and surveillance at the cost of a longer turnaround time, need of a culture, and need of appropriate laboratories to deal with cultures, and need of proper IT infrastructures for data analysis. On the right, there is another approach. This is targeted sequencing, that is the selective amplification of some regions of interest in the M. tuberculosis genome, working directly from patient samples, so it doesn't require the need of a culture. And usually the genome, the genes, the parts of the genomes that are interrogated are those that are relevant for drug resistance and prediction and genotyping. So here the workflow starts from an entry diagnosis done with a rapid diagnostics, low complexity, near point of care. Then the samples is referred for targeted sequencing, DNA extractions and targeted sequencing, and results can be obtained in less than 1 week. Most of the TNGS kits are available as commercial kits, and this enables a better standardization of the laboratory workflows, and also comes with their own analysis and data interpretation software that, of course, simplifies the bioinformatics steps. Of course, it has lower resolutions for transmission analysis and can only detect, TNGS can only detect the mutations that are known and included in the gene panel. And it works with lower amounts of DNA, so can work with direct samples, but still there's some limit of detection to be taken into consideration to have a successful targeted sequencing from samples. I just share with you an output of the technologies that are available to do next generation sequencing. And there are several manufacturers nowadays, and I would start from clinical and surveillance outputs. So the question here is, what results do we need? If it is targeted resistance, the targeted sequencing approach from direct sample is a good approach. If we want to have full drug susceptibility profiles, transmission analysis, support to the public health investigations, WGS, whole genome sequencing from cultures would be better fitting. And in terms of resolutions of the genomes, if we want to look at all the structural variations, such as repetitive regions in the genomes, long reads will be better than short reads. Then we need also to consider the turnaround time. Smaller instruments provide results for fewer samples, but in a faster turnaround time. Large systems, you need to wait for batching, to wait for having the appropriate number of samples to do the run, and it will take longer for sequencing. But of course, the throughput will be higher. In terms of data accuracy, we know well that short reads are provide very good accuracy, and it's a standard, I would say, for drug resistance calling in M. tuberculosis. Long reads now have a sufficient quality for many applications, and also they resolve these complicated regions in the MTB genome that are not easily resolved by short read sequencing. The take-home message here is, for me, is that there is no best NGS platforms. There are the best platforms that fit for different questions, clinical questions, number of samples that you want to sequence, what is the turnaround time that you want to follow, and what are the infrastructures, laboratory infrastructures that are available in your systems. So the selection of the technologies consider, I would say, 4 factors: accuracy, speed, throughput, and flexibility. And there's no platforms that maximize all 4 together. So that's why there is the need of a good planning and good choice of the instruments before starting the programmatic use of sequencing. And these are some examples of how some NGS platforms fit in different environments. So it is important to choose the right tool in the right settings. So for small clinical labs, likely the small instruments, those that are called benchtop instruments, will be enough for whole genome sequencing of few samples or for targeted sequencing. Otherwise, if you go to reference centers, research centers, you will need instruments that enables a higher throughput for having more samples submitted to WGS in single runs. Of course, if you want to go in the field, you will need to use very small instruments, those that are called portable instruments. And targeted sequencing here will be the preferred option. Just a focus on the Illumina technology, that is the most common technology that is used in the field, and I think also in Brazil. It reports very high accuracy for resistance calling, very good batching capacity. There is a low cost per sample at scale, and a lot of bioinformatics pipelines have been developed considering Illumina data. And here on the right, you see this table that is an example on what are the outputs depending on the instruments available from Illumina that is used and whether WGS or TNGS applications are preferred. You see that there are very small instruments that enable to have from few to 10 samples sequenced per run, per week, and there are bigger instruments where you can sequence and multiplex many, several samples, even hundreds of samples. So let's now look on how NGS for MTB is being used as a diagnostic tool. We do have recommendations from the WHO, starting from 2024 and now also 2025. And WHO is recommended for use as a follow-on test to detect drug resistance in people with pulmonary TB and RIF-resistant pulmonary TB. And you see here the list of drugs that are recommended for use, and you see that there are very important drugs such as fluoroquinolones, bedaquiline, linezolid, clofazimine, and pyrazinamide. We have 3 solutions recommended so far, and in particular 2 solutions, Diplex on Illumina and AMPOR-TB on nanopore sequencing are recommended for the largest number of drugs. Some notes to these recommendations from the WHO. TNGS is currently suitable for use at central laboratory, reference laboratory level, because anyway is a bit complicated, but we will come to that. This class does not replace the entry test, those rapid tests that are meant for initial diagnosis and drug-resistant TB diagnosis, because these are more accessible and cheaper. But however, this is a class of test, TNGS, is considered an alternative for prioritized patient populations that requires comprehensive DST, faster than phenotypic DST. Phenotypic DST is still recommended for confirmation of second-line drugs, or where the performance of sequencing is still suboptimal. The priority for testing will be given to samples that are, I would say, at least smear positive. And these are the features of the 3 solutions, but you can see that they have similar features and similar laboratory, I would say, requirements, except that for the AMPOR-TB and the 3rd technologies, you can use them on the nanopore sequencing device compared to the Illumina for the diplex mid-TB. Then when we move to WGS rather than targeted sequencing, we know that WGS is a reference standard as equally to phenotypic DST for several drugs, and it can also balance some of the limitation of the phenotypic DST. It is very useful for those drugs for which phenotypic DST is unreliable, or for those settings that do not have the capacity to perform phenotypic DST. For example, tubedaquiline, clofazimine, linezolid, delamanid. And the use of NGS can reduce the need for phenotypic DST for patient care decisions, in particular if you think to patients with drug susceptible TB. How we are analyzing the data, interpreting the data for drug resistance using sequencing data. Well, this is I would say that became easier since the development of standardized catalogs of mutations for the association between phenotypic and genotypic drug resistance. And here we do have the WHO mutation catalog. Now we have the 2nd edition of the WHO mutation catalogs that is used and provides a list of confidence-graded genetic markers of phenotypic resistance that can guide the diagnosis and surveillance of resistant cases. And here I will not spend much time on this slide, but I just want to show you that for any of the drugs or of the drug classes, we have recommendations on how mutations can guide the clinical decisions, whether to keep or remove a drug for a given regimen, whether to give higher or lower doses of a drug, depending on the mutation that is found in the genome, whether there is a mutation that conferred cross-resistance to different drugs within a class or to different to drugs of different classes. And here I want to show you how WGS and TNGS perform in the selections of drug regimens, including the new regimens. And you see that targeted sequencing is the blue bar, for example. WGS is the light blue, and you can see here how good the two approaches perform compared to the phenotypic DST, which is the red bar, when guiding the use of longer regimens, BPALM, and other regimens. You see that the performance of targeted sequencing is very high, above, I would say, the 70–80% of regimens are correctly informed by the use of TNGS, and WGS performs almost equally as phenotypic DST. So they are great tools to inform the use of new regimens. This is an example of a comparison between WGS and targeted sequencing conducted in South Africa in 90 patients with RRTB. The findings of the authors are that drug resistance inference was largely concordant between targeted sequencing and WGS. Of course, WGS offered higher resolutions for genetic relatedness transmission analysis. And here you can see with different colors the clusters informed by WGS, whereas TNGS informed just at lineage, sublineage level, the identity of two strains. And also you can look at the mutation profiles to see whether they are equal or not between two patients, but it doesn't assign more resolutions than this. And TNGS was very good to detect also those mutations found at low frequency that are fixing in the genomes and could be correlated to drug resistance. How NGS fits in the diagnostic algorithms will be covered by Harald in the next presentation. I just want to underline here the main questions that we have. Which samples need to go to WGS from cultures or TNGS from respiratory samples? So we need to think of what is the best positioning of NGS into diagnostic algorithms. And this is an example coming from the literature, for example. If you add to the rapid assays the use of TNGS, you will inform the use of regimens such as BPAL or longer MDR regimens being blinded currently using TNGS just to the lamanid and pretomanid resistance. With WGS, you can also predict resistance to these drugs. So most of the drugs, you have information from the sequencing data. In terms of diagnostic reporting, this will be also covered by Harald, but I want just to share a few technical concepts to understand the reports that are sent from laboratories to clinicians. And some of these parameters refer to the quality of the sequencing data. As any other rapid test, any other molecular test, or any other test that is used in the TB laboratories, it is important to assess the quality of the results before sharing it for clinical or surveillance decisions. And one of these is the genome coverage. So how much of the genome or the targeted genome was successfully sequenced. The read depth, that means how many times on average each base in the reference genome or target genome was sequenced. And then the mutations detection. And if we look at the use of the WHO catalog, you see that there are five groups, and these groups needs to be understood well. There are two groups that are associated with resistance. So if a mutation belongs to a given group associated with resistance to a given drug, and if it's group 1, group 2, this will be associated with drug resistance. If it is 4 and 5, it's not associated with resistance. And there is an unclear role if it is associated with group 3. And the last is the genotyping, because as mentioned, a report will include also lineage information, and if it is WGS, also transmission analysis. And this is the strain classification that we can consider the fingerprint for the pathogen. And ideally, to reach these outputs, we will use validated and standardized bioinformatic pipelines that can require bioinformatics knowledge or less. Some simple tools for analysis of sequencing data, for example, is the TB profiler. And for transmission analysis, for example, we have the Bruker Rhythm Typer software. How NGS is being used for public health surveillance? We know already since several years that next generation sequencing, both whole genome sequencing and targeted sequencing, are used as a cost-effective and comprehensive tool for DST in the surveillance of drug resistance in tuberculosis. And there's already a lot of genome sequences that have been collected since several years by the WHO that inform, for example, the development of new editions of the WHO mutation catalog. And we see here how many thousands of genome sequences have been shared at global level in different global. This is an example of a country high burden for tuberculosis, Ethiopia, that conducted their third national drug resistance survey incorporating the use of whole genome sequencing. So they provided the estimates for drug resistance in the country nationwide using whole genome sequencing. They also screened the resistance to the second-line drugs, new drugs such as bedaquiline. They also looked at the genotypes that are circulating in the different parts of the country, in the different regions of the country, and if they are associated with drug resistance or not, so their association with drug resistance, and whether there are big transmission chains that are occurring in specific parts of the country. And I think this is a very valuable tool to support also public health actions at country level. This is another example of the use of NGS in surveillance, and this is for bedaquiline resistant surveillance, a study conducted in the Western Cape, again in South Africa, using deeplex targeted sequencing. And the authors here estimated the prevalence of bedaquiline resistance of baseline samples and where they occurred, whether there were transmission chains of bedaquiline resistance, so strains that were transmitting bedaquiline resistance, and whether there was a lot of heteroresistance. And for example, here, I think one important message is that the mutations that are conferring resistance to bedaquiline, RV0678 gene is a common gene, heteroresistance, so the presence of minor frequency variants was found in 1/3 of bedaquiline resistant isolates. And I think this is something that maybe needs to be discussed further. And then I looked on how NGS is being used in Latin America for tuberculosis. I was curious and I looked in literature what is available. I found this comment made by the National TB program that outlined the impacts of the coordinated genomic surveillance on TB control. Of course, the implementation of sequencing would have impact on the detection of drug resistance, on the mapping of transmission, and in terms of programmatic and policy support. And I think one of the conclusions of the authors is very interesting. So they say that the tools and technologies already exist, are there already. For example, NGS, and now it is urgent that we start implementing effectively them and programmatically now. And of course, there are existing networks that aim to implement genomic surveillance for tuberculosis, and one is hosting the webinar today. And I also found an initiative from PAHO. And this initiative, of course, aims to scale up laboratory capacity for sequencing and also the capacity to generate real-time data to support surveillance systems. I also found some study in literature of, in particular, the detection of resistance, of the characterization by sequencing of drug-resistant cases, pre-XDR and XDR, and I found similar studies in Mexico, in Brazil, Pará, I know we have representatives here, and in Argentina. But I wanted to focus on this study that was published, I think, last year, and it was conducted in Pará, northern Brazil, and it was an investigation that was based on whole genome sequencing. It was where the authors found a unique genotype, specific genotype, that is associated with MDR-TB, and it is spreading in this state. And they found, according to the different geographical distribution, two closely linked transmission chains. However, they didn't find geographic clustering in the metropolitan regions of Belém and Colares. And I think this is an important finding and has implication because it suggests that there is the existence of overlooked cases. So there is need to extend the genomic surveillance to all the cases that are notified, or drug-resistant cases that are notified in the state. Now, moving to the performance and costs of next-generation sequencing, I think that this table summarizes perfectly what are the performance of targeted sequencing, the first two columns, compared to phenotypic DST, and also in comparison to the other rapid assays that are available and recommended by the WHO. You see, I mean, the performance, sensitivity, specificity are very good, but you see how many more drugs are interrogated by the targeted sequencing approaches when compared to the other rapid assays. So the resolutions, I would say that it's really much higher compared to other rapid assays. So it's really a tool that can be used for full drug susceptibility testing. And if we look at the performance that are reported in the second edition of the WHO mutation catalog, you see that, for example, I mean, beyond the first line drugs that we know that sequencing works very well, we have also very good sensitivity in using sequencing and the detection of mutations for predicting phenotypic resistance to the fluoroquinolones. And for bedaquiline is increasing. Now the coverage is at more than 50%. And now the edition 3 of the catalog is being released later this year. And we expect a further increase in the sensitivity of the predictions to resistance to bedaquiline, linezolid, delamanid, and pretomamine. I share with you these, the findings of this study that has been conducted in high burden settings. And here the authors outline the changes to the treatment that would have been based on WGS compared to the existing standard of care. And you see that 24% of patients, if there was availability of WGS data for the 24% of patients with MDR-TB, this information would have allowed more effective treatment individualizations compared to other rapid assays and compared to waiting for the availability of the phenotypic DST. So very important impact of the use of sequencing. In Italy, of course, this is where we are from. And we demonstrated that WGS from early positive liquid cultures provides quicker results compared to the phenotypic DST. On average, I would say within 1 week from culture positivity compared to the phenotypic DST. And very important outcome in low incidence settings, MDR settings such as Italy, WGS would avoid the need of phenotypic DST for more than 80% of samples that show full susceptibility on the first line drugs. So no need for phenotypic confirmation in this case. What about the cost effectiveness of the TNGS intervention? This is an analysis that has been done in South Africa, where they assumed the 6% of bedaquiline resistance and the availability of targeted sequencing results from patient samples in 10 days. And they compared the impact of this compared to the standard of care, which is expert, followed by expert XDR and phenotypic DST, at least to the drugs included in the BPAL regimen. And TNGS reported the higher proportion of resistance profile being correctly identified as compared to the standard of care, provided results faster than the standard of care, much faster. You see here the difference, 14 versus 56 days. And in South Africa, a fully centralized DST algorithms with testing conducted at the single site would have been more cost effective than the standard of care. Of course, here we have to acknowledge that South Africa has a robust specimen transport network that enables quite easily a fully centralized DST system. This could not apply everywhere. This is a second cost effectiveness study that has been conducted. Is another studies where the authors evaluated 9 different diagnostic strategies, and the standard of care here is the expert followed by expert XDR and again phenotypic DST. Here in terms of cost effectiveness, expert followed by the phenotypic DST was the most cost effective. However, TNGS and PDST yielded the greatest health benefits in terms of lowest DALYs, highest early treatment rate, and lowest mortality. But of course, a bit less cost effective compared to phenotypic DST alone. But TNGS alone could be a cost effective alternative when phenotypic density is unavailable. And it is important in particular for the new and repurposed drugs that are used in the MDR regimens. Now, moving to the last part of my presentation is about implementation. Here I asked what is the country level NGS sequencing capacity, and looking at the global situations. You see that sequencing capacity is highly uneven worldwide. In yellow here we have a partial capacity, red is limited capacity, green is good capacity. Many countries built capacity after the COVID pandemic, leverage, I would say, under laboratory point of view on the COVID pandemic to establish sequencing capacity and transfer it to TB sequencing and sequencing of other pathogens of concern. And the major gaps that are found are in the laboratory infrastructures, bioinformatics, supply of the and procurement of the sequencing reagents. And last but not least, I would say, integration of data with existing disease surveillance systems. Some key reflection for integrating NGS into the programmatic algorithms. So these are some of the questions that TB programs need to answer when planning the programmatic use of sequencing. So what is the prevalence of resistance? How many samples we would need to submit to sequence? What is the intended use? We want to use it as a diagnostic tool, real-time, prospective, or as a surveillance tool, or both, because these would have implications on the different selection of the machines, instruments that are small or instruments that are big. Are we going with WGS or targeted sequencing? In other words, are we interested in also transmission analysis, research, surveillance, or just diagnostics? Because our capacity to sequence allows us to do simple tools such as targeted sequencing. How are we implementing sequencing in the diagnostic cascade? Is it complementing other tests that are used in the TB laboratories or replacing some of them? And then the strategies of centralizing versus decentralizing. And importantly here, I would underline that maybe the strategy that is based on creating sequencing hubs for multi-disease testing could be the most effective. And this is a roadmap that has been described, an experience described in the Heberden settings in Africa, Namibia, where we developed a roadmap for building NGS capacity. There are 3 phases. In the first is the preparation, the planning, where the main outcomes of the interventions are outlined and prepared. The second is implementation, the practical work, where the infrastructure is built, the pilot is conducted, and the technology is validated. And then the third is the scale up, so implementing the use of the sequencing technologies into the local guidelines. There are several challenges. I tried to summarize all of them in one slide, collecting the experience coming from different countries that you see listed in this slide. Of course, some of the main challenging is with the setting up of the infrastructure because it's expensive. It has a cost. And it is complex. The test is more complicated than other molecular tests that are used in the laboratories. There is need of specialized staff and infrastructures. The procurement of reagents is quite demanding compared to other reagents. And also how you handle the data, you store them, and how you report it. And then there is also a question on the value and access, because the risk with the centralized placement of sequencing is that maybe this is not accessible for the population from all over the country. So there is the need to ensure proper transport conditions and transport of samples to the labs that perform sequencing to enable all the patients with TB and drug-resistant TB to have access to this very good technology. What ensures that sequencing is successful in the TB laboratories? Here is a message for the laboratories, but also for the clinicians, because the success of WGS and also of targeted sequencing, it does not rely just on the sequencing part or the analysis, but from the beginning when the samples are collected. So you see here some of the most common failure points for sequencing, for example, is extracting material from samples with low bacillary load, inefficient extraction, so let's say suboptimal procedures or errors that may occur during the laboratory testing. And here are some of the sequencing metrics that can alert on some of the likely problems when doing the wet part, the laboratory part, and we can maybe discuss that later if you are interested. But I want to say that the fastest genome starts with the right samples. So the success of targeted sequencing in particular depends primarily on the bacillary load of the samples. TNGS works well on smear positive samples, may fail when you go to the smear negative samples, or would say very low trace grading on the expert ultra testing. The sample volume must be appropriate. The sample must be handled properly, so in terms of storage and referral to the laboratories, and this to avoid contaminations, for example. So these are parameters that do not depend on the sequencer or the sequencing technology. And these are some of the recommendations for the collection of a samples that is well suitable for direct sequencing or sequencing after culture, and collecting the appropriate volume of sample, and having backup for repeat testing if needed, and the clinicians giving clear instructions to patients to collect a proper sample. What's new? And this is the last part of my presentation. What's new in the field? Well, we have several new things coming. Of course, one is the assistance of the artificial intelligence in analyzing, interpreting, and reporting the sequencing data that are generated in the TB laboratories. The expansion of sequencing devices, in particular to more portable sequencing that can be placed at more peripheral levels. We have new advancement in the accuracy of long-read sequencing. You know, long-read sequencing have good potential, and if it becomes more accurate, less expensive, of course, it has the potential also to replace short-read sequencing because of their good features. Culture-independent sequencing, I will show you a few things after this slide on this point. The integration of the sequencing information into electronic systems. We are expecting tools that can simplify this process, and then reducing costs, because it's true that sequencing is expensive. So we need to find solutions that enable us to decrease the cost. And this could be by including sequencing into the global drug facility list at negotiated price, pooled procurement of all the reagents that are needed for the sequencing, not just the sequencing kits or the bundled supply. And then not just genomics, but trying to integrate all the omics that are made available by the sequencing instruments. And these include also the transcriptomics, proteomics. So looking better and in more details into the post-pathogen interaction. Regarding the culture-free sequencing, we do have new solutions coming to the market. And one is the new duplex versions for targeted sequencing. And this new assay will include also predominant resistance and more targets for bedaquiline resistance. So it will become more complete, I would say. And also moving WGS from culture WGS to culture-free WGS. So try to sequence the whole genome sequence of M. tuberculosis directly from patient samples. And this because of the better resolutions of sequencing of whole genome sequencing compared to targeted sequencing. And we evaluated these two new approaches in our laboratory, and we compared the new duplex with the whole genome sequencing from sputum when compared to the culture WGS. And you see here the performance of TNGS versus WGS. Targeted sequencing, you see from patient samples, extremely high validity success rate, 97%, with a very low limit of detection, 10 total genome copies, that I would say that is more or less comparable now to the very low grading score at the expert testing, so very good sensitivity. But interestingly, when we look at the whole genome sequencing done directly from patient samples, we see that we had success successful results in 3/4 of our study collection. 75%, we could retrieve a whole genome sequencing from the patient sample. And these were well suitable for drug resistance analysis with a limit of detection of 100 total genome copies. And very good genotyping concordance with the cultured WGS. And in particular, I want to show you that we compared also the transmission analysis done from direct WGS when compared to the cultured WGS. And we can see here, this was a limited sample size study collection, but we can see that nicely the direct sequencing approach was able to detect the same cluster identified by the cultured WGS. So we had comparable results without the need of a culture. Then moving to drug resistance prediction, very good for the duplex targeted sequencing analysis. And with just a few cases of discrepancy because we found minor frequency variants in the targeted sequencing that were not found in cultured WGS. These could be mutations that were not fixed over time, or could be a selection bias of the culture step. With direct sequencing, we had good performance, and I would say that the only problems that we had were not on technical problems, so not on the sequencing reaction, but rather on the software in interpretation of the mutations that were suboptimal for a few drugs, but this can be easily fixed by updating and editing the rules for the software interpretation of them. So moving to the conclusions, genomics is already redefining the fight against tuberculosis. Sequencing is a reference lab tool that accelerates full DST that match the new MDR regimens. One test serves both patient care and surveillance and complements phenotypic DST and replaces other rapid assays. I want to say that the implementation is not really technological, it's rather organizational. So we need to understand where to put the right instruments in order to be effective for the TB control program. And the intervention must be clear and actionable. So which isolates should be sent for sequencing? And we will hear from Harald and Daniel about this. Currently, the use of sequencing is recommended at central level because of the complexity of the protocols. And usually I see observing the countries that it is being implemented at a hub and spoke model. The peripheral labs send the samples to the reference lab that reports the results back to the peripheral labs for clinical action. And sequencing bridges quite nicely research, clinical care, public health action. And the implementation requires capacity, investment, and collaboration. When comparing TNGS from samples compared to the culture-based WGS, TNGS, good thing, targeted sequencing, it is that is standardized, but of course doesn't enable the same extended analysis that are enabled by whole genome sequencing. That is crucial, in particular in our settings, if like Italy, low incidence settings, because it also tracks transmissions and enables to restrict the use of phenotypic DST. And now we have this innovation of direct WGS that could provide, very comprehensive results directly from patient samples, saving the time that is needed for getting the culture. And I think this is a very good innovation, and I think it will improve in the coming years. This was my last slide, and I want to thank you all for your attention. I'm ready for questions, if any, and I will stop sharing now. Thank you very much.
Muito obrigada, doutor André, pela excelente palestra. Nós vamos pedir para fazer a discussão no final, para poder juntar as percepções, né, de todos. E eu vou agora fazer uma breve apresentação do Dr. Harald, que é o nosso próximo palestrante. O Dr. Harald trabalha, né, e também em um laboratório supranacional de referência da OMS para o diagnóstico de tuberculose na Alemanha, e tem se dedicado há bastante tempo, mais de 15 anos, às capacidades de laboratório para melhorar o diagnóstico da tuberculose e outras micobactérias. Nós vamos, então, ouvir o Dr. Harold sobre sua experiência em relação à tradução desses resultados para a clínica, né, e relato desses resultados e como eles podem ser utilizados para ajudar na medicina de precisão. Muito obrigada, Dr. Harold.
Well, thank you. Thank you for inviting me to this very nice webinar. It's always difficult to speak after Andrea. He is such an expert in the field, and also his talks are so wonderful to listen to. That's I hope I will still be comprehensive and also complementary to him, since I'm more focusing on the clinical part, and I will try to share my screen first. I'm not 100% sure how it works. Do you see now the presentation mode, or do you see probably the normal mode? And now it's the presentation mode? Yeah?
Isso, agora a apresentação.
Okay, wonderful. So my part will be to discuss the faster diagnostics for better care and how to integrate TNGS in clinical reasonable diagnostic algorithms. The next 45 minutes will focus on the clinical impact of rapid and NGS-based TB diagnostics on time to treatment onset, but also on the morbidity and quality of life and the very limited data that we have on it. The reasonable diagnostic algorithms, as I mentioned, will follow with the consideration of the challenges, particularly of a second encounter of patients, which is a difficult thing that you all know from your TB programs. I will offer possibilities for ultra-fast one-day diagnostics integrated in a diagnostic algorithm. Whether it's reasonable or not very much depends on your local needs. I will briefly discuss which TNGS test to use and for which purpose. And Andrea already did it so extensively that I will really just drive it. And how to use NGS results to guide clinical decision-making and the key conclusions, of course. This is what you can expect in the next 45 minutes. Let's start with the impact of rapid TB diagnostics on the time to treatment onset. And let me start with the new history of TB. We all know the new interest in the asymptomatic and subclinical TB, and this directly correlates with the need of rapid diagnostics. This is now the pathogenesis, very much simplified, of TB. We start with the infection, and then the patient enters the phase of latent TB, which can reactivate and pass through a very short phase of incipient TB. And then the patient enters the phase of asymptomatic and subclinical TB, where they don't have symptoms, at least not symptoms which are directly related to a TB, but they already feel some or can feel some sickness, but mostly they don't really feel very sick. Until the active TB is then kicking in, and then the diagnosis might be established or the patient dies eventually. In all these phases, asymptomatic and active TB, and also early or shortly before the patient dies, the patient is infectious. And as soon as he becomes, or the TB becomes active, we are increasing the risk of long-term complications by 3- or 4-fold. Which means once the patient is actively feeling the TB, here's a high risk of lifelong complications of the disease. Treatment, of course, shall shorten this problem with the long-term complication, and the faster diagnostics is, the less the patient has a risk of long-term complications. And also the transmission can be shortened when we have a good treatment and early onset of treatment, because we reduce the time when the patient is infectious for others. Active case finding would, of course, be optimal because then we could find patients already in the asymptomatic phase, but at least shortening diagnostic delays would already help a lot to reduce morbidity of patients long term. And this is where TNGS can play a role when we are talking about multi-drug resistant or drug-resistant TB. And of course, rapid diagnostics with PCR is the tool that we need for all TB cases because that's the one which establishes the diagnosis. Celso, who is probably also here in the auditorium, Celso has published a beautiful study last year in the Lancet Primary Care where he was one of the first really proving that rapid diagnostics using molecular tools is really reducing the time until the patient receives anti-TB treatment. So far, we all believe when we are fast in the lab, that the patient receives the treatment much earlier. But when you go in the field, you know that it can take 2 weeks until the doctor receives the report when there is no logistic system established. Or the samples can be stored in the lab for a couple of days because they don't have a everyday PCR established. But when you have a programmatic approach for rapid diagnostics, then TB treatment onset can be reduced to less than 7 days, or in 80% of cases, even at the same day when the patient goes to the doctor, the treatment can start. And this is what happened in Mozambique during this study. Now, can this be translated one-to-one to next-generation sequencing? The biggest study so far is probably the Seek and Treat survey, which was conducted by FINE. And this is one of the publications which came out of it. The diagnostic algorithm the study team used was that they collected samples, they decontaminated the samples, resuspended it in 600 microliters in 4 milliliters of phosphate buffered saline. And 600 microliters of this was applied to GeneXpert. When TB was found, then 200 microliters were used for GenoScreen and at the same time 700 microliters for nanopore sequencing with the Ampor TB from Oxford Nanopore. In parallel, they inoculated cultures, performed phenotypic DST, and for this, like this, they had a direct comparison not only between the different tools, GenoScreen on Illumina versus Ampor TB on the GridION or MinION. They also had a direct comparison with standard of care consisting of GeneXpert plus phenotypic DST. And they said, yes, there is evidence that we can reduce the time to regimen selection, at least to well-informed regimen selection. But even under study conditions, the data was not strong enough to give a clear-cut number of reduction. And this was mainly because samples were shipped. Samples had to be shipped from the periphery to central laboratories, and this shipment time, and then the batching and the waiting until the sequencing happened. This is what Andrea already mentioned. When you have large machines, you usually batch samples. Then you lose time. And this reduced this strong effect of time to regimen because of the long transportation times. But what they found is that targeted sequencing informs the doctor quite well in the decision which drugs to use, but not as well as this conventional DST or the whole genome sequencing. So it seems when you look at the number that over 90% of the cases which received whole genome sequencing or phenotypic drug susceptibility led to very well informed decisions by the clinical doctors on the treatment regimens BPAM, REZ, levofloxacin for the isoniazid-resistant TB, HRZE for the fully susceptible TB, but also for fluoroquinolone-based regimens. When you look at the targeted sequencing results, this is the upper two lines, then you see that the percentage is only between 75 and 85%. And this is for mostly the reasons that Andrea already mentioned. You pay the price for faster diagnostics with less informative diagnostics because you don't have the whole genome in front of you, and you don't have the phenotypic outcome in front of you. You can only focus on those targets that you have included in your assay. And this, of course, gives you not the full picture. But still, fast or speed is quality in medical diagnostics. The faster you are, the less morbidity you can expect. That's what we hope. And that's why I think this is a good compromise, at least to choose. There is another study, which is a meta-analysis by the Swiss group from Bern, and they said that from looking at all the different studies, which are at least 24 studies that they included in the meta-analysis, they can see that 1 to 10 days, the total TAD is usually for targeted sequencing. It's not faster because of the transportation effect. And here you see the countries which performed most of the sequencing, while all the gray countries perform rarely or irregularly the targeted sequencing or not at all. Which seems that most of the sequencing is performed in China, India, South Africa, Europe, and the USA and Mexico, but very little performed in any other countries. And I think this webinar is hopefully motivating you to at least erase the gray in the South American zone and also in other countries of Europe, hopefully. There is, however, even in the study that the Swiss people performed, although we have strong evidence that it's accelerating the diagnostics, it's very low quality of evidence that this translates into a measurable deduction in the time to a fully effective regimen. And this can be for many reasons, but we can only speculate. And one of the reasons we will discuss a little bit later. Can we see an impact of rapid TB diagnostics on treatment outcome, morbidity, or the quality of life? There is one study, which is, again, only a modeling study because a real-life survey has not yet been performed proving that morbidity is reduced, but at least a modeling study showed that we have a reduction of the disability-adjusted life years by 2.4 per case, which means when we are fast with diagnostics and we diagnose TB very early, we reduce on average the long-term consequences and complications of TB by 2.4 per TB patient. And this is a lot. 2.4 years less suffering on average. I think that's worthwhile every effort that we can make to study or to implement faster tools. However, this study was unfortunately not using any genetic tool. It was using chest X-ray. But it shows us the faster we are with diagnostics. That's all the key message it brings. The faster we are with diagnostics. And it doesn't matter whether you use the chest X-ray or whether you use PCR-based or sequencing-based diagnostic tools. The faster you are, the less the patients suffer. We did a study in Kyrgyzstan where we investigated the association with the number of drugs that are used in regimens and tested susceptible with whole genome sequencing with the probability that the patient converts in culture. And you see here in red those cases which had less than 3 drugs matching with the whole genome sequencing predicted susceptibility of the bacteria. And in green, those which had 3 or more matches, which means the patient received a drug which was tested susceptible by whole genome sequencing. And you see that those which had more than 3 or equal than 3 with matches had much better probability of conversion than those which had less than 3 matches. And this was even slightly significant. This did not occur at all when we compared the same with the local standard, which was consisting of phenotypic DST and the gene expert. So I think this is at least an indirect indicator that when you have a match in your whole genome sequencing and the treatment regimen, and you use a drug which was tested susceptible by genomic means, at least 3 drugs should be used, and then you have a very high probability that the patient converts within the first 6 months of treatment. For MDR-TB, this is more or less the time that WHO has defined for treatment success. But it's unfortunately still not a direct indicator that we have a clinical impact on treatment outcome or less morbidity. All we have are indirect markers, but no direct evidence. But the indirect evidence is quite at least vast. We have probably or most likely a reduced transmission, because when we predict the resistance patterns and we give an MDR-TB treatment, we know that from the first day onwards, the patient is most likely not infectious anymore. This is what we learned from the guinea pig experiments that Edward Mandel did in South Africa, but also other authors, but the most meaningful were those of Edward Mandel. So the first day of fully active MDR-TB treatment is already reducing the transmission of TB almost to 0. And this means less TB patients are infected, less transmission of MDR-TB means also better control of TB, etc., etc. We reduce the individual morbidity most likely because we reduce the time, and then we can hopefully also reduce the disability-adjusted life years for multi-drug resistant TB. We reduce hospitalization time and save a lot of money for the public health system, and we reduce costs also for other means like the transportation to the doctor, etc. All this is strengthen your health system quite a bit. So we have many good reasons, many good reasons to implement fast diagnostics, and also for MDR-TB, fast diagnostics based on targeted sequencing. And we have seen that this gives you very good and strong information for a reasonable decision on a working or effective anti-TB treatment regimen. Now let's think how this could be integrated into a diagnostic algorithm. In 2019, we performed a Central Asian workshop on NGS in the framework of the USAID Stop TTH program. And the algorithm that all the experts agreed upon was like this. We said that once you have a TB suspect, you will perform a TB PCR with GeneXpert Ultra, BDMAX, Abbott, or whatever you have on site. When this PCR is negative, an expert committee will review the case after 2 weeks of non-specific respiratory infection treatment. And eventually the case will be re-evaluated by PCR. Once the PCR is positive, you look for resistance markers for rifampicin. When those are positive, everybody agreed upon targeted sequencing or whole genome sequencing. But since this is giving us the delay of culture, everybody was in favor of targeted sequencing. And then a fully informed, individualized, or standardized MDR-TB treatment should be given. Now, for isoniazid resistance, we said that when the INH resistance marker is positive, we don't need sequencing unless we also have additional resistance markers for fluoroquinolones. And since the genotype MTB-DRSL from Bruker is much cheaper than sequencing, we would first perform the line probe assay. When there is no evidence of fluoroquinolone susceptibility, the patient would receive isoniazid resistance anti-TB treatment. If there is an evidence of fluoroquinolones, then we are facing a much more complicated case, and targeted sequencing might be useful, particularly in the case the patient suffers from hepatitis from pyrazinamide or isoniazid, which will then be given for 9 months in total. So that's the algorithm we said would be reasonable. Now, you need to consider that Central Asia is one of the hotspots of multi-drug resistant TB in the world. At that time, 2019, we had more than 30% of all TB cases being multi-drug resistant, and of the younger generation below 25 years of age, it was even 50% in the capitals. That's why the fast resistance testing is, of course, a completely different urgency than in countries where you have a very low incidence of multi-drug TB, where you are more looking on an individual level, while here we have a real programmatic emergency that we are facing in the countries. Now, meanwhile, there has been a recommendation developed by the European Reference Laboratory Network. It's a lot of authors from Daniela Cirillo's group. Andrea is, I think, one of the authors, but also Francesca Saluzzo, etc. And I think this is a very interesting algorithm when you are in a setting where you are mainly using BPAM and bedaquiline-based regimens. Let's start with again, with the PCR. The PCR diagnoses TB and gives you a marker for rifampicin resistance or MDR-TB. Then you're looking for evidence that you're facing an increased risk of bedaquiline resistance. Arguments for an increased risk could be, according to the authors, contact to a bedaquiline-resistant case or previous bedaquiline-resistant treatment failure. We just have a case here in our hospital, a Ukrainian soldier who came with, after he completed a BPAM regimen for 6 months, and now the regimen was stopped approximately 4 months ago, and then now he has a relapse with a positive culture. We do not yet have the results, but this case definitely has a very high risk of bedaquiline resistance, and rapid diagnostics would be required. So we look for targeted sequencing. And a high prevalence of bedaquiline resistance in the country could be also another challenge. For example, in Eswatini, where you have a clone with a very high risk of bedaquiline resistance. Now, the authors also included isoniazid resistance. I'm not fully understanding where the link is between isoniazid resistance and the bedaquiline resistance. I think the fluoroquinolones would be much more important, and I would rather follow in those cases the diagnostic algorithm that we developed for Central Asia. But I think that's always depending very much on your local situation and your epidemiological situation that you are facing. Now, you see here that unless you have multi-drug resistant or rifampicin resistant, the authors do not recommend targeted sequencing. They are rather going for whole genome sequencing after you have a positive culture instead of phenotypic DST. And then they only recommend the phenotypic DST for those cases where whole genome sequencing is giving unknown mutations or special constellations that require resolution or some troubleshooting. This is very much depending on your capacities in the laboratory. Do you have the capacities for whole genome sequencing do you have the money? Do you have the equipment? Do you have enough cases to make it also fast enough? If you need to batch, because otherwise you would pay 2,000 euro per case, it might be more reasonable to focus rather on phenotypic DST. But as soon as you have enough cases and you do the whole genome sequencing on a regular basis, at least on a weekly basis, I think then this is a very reasonable algorithm that you could follow. Now, you already see how much of it is important to really discuss the situation with experts in the field and discuss your own situation, not because you cannot trust your own thinking. I think it's really always good to discuss with others who have already experienced from different countries and have seen different constellations your situation, and then you get recommendations, and with those you can make a reasonable decision how to set up your diagnostic algorithm for your country, because so many factors are influencing it. One of the factors is the challenge of the second encounter. Here you see several studies, and I think there are plenty more. I've seen in Copenhagen last year on the Union Conference, I've seen many posters which focused on the challenge that patients who are supposed to come with the second sputum samples, they simply don't show up again. In India, you see up to 30% did not show up. In Ethiopia, 6.2%. In India, another study, 15.6%, which did not provide a second sample, and 34% finally completely were lost also for treatment. In Pakistan, 88%, which means a substantial number of patients does not show up again to give you a second sputum sample. For those cases, it would certainly be good to have a one-day diagnostic algorithm. You get the sputum from the patient, you fix the patient on a chair and make sure he does not leave your laboratory or your clinic until you have the results. And as long as you get the results on the same day, the patients usually are willing to wait for it. And then you give the patient the results and also the complete diagnosis with the treatment regimen. One of the approaches would be the one that was also presented on the Union Conference last year and also published last year. This is targeted sequencing as a primary diagnostic instead of GeneXpert, instead of BDMAX, instead of any MWR, RD. And the authors say that it's as sensitive as the GeneXpert is. And this is also what Andrea mentioned. In our hands with the ONT, we had 10 to 100 times less technical sensitivity, which means the limit of detection was 10 to 100 bacteria higher than the BDMAX or the GeneXpert. But I think this depends a little bit on the sample treatment before you use it for sequencing. And there's probably some optimization possible. At least in China, the authors claim that they have the same sensitivity. And then you see here, that's the workflow. And they get then the full resistome directly from the sample within a couple of hours. They say that this assay is so cheap that it's even reaching the price of GeneXpert. Very much depends on how much you pay for a cartridge. When you pay 40 euro, like we usually pay in Europe, then probably it could be possible. When you pay $7.50, like most of the countries do, it might not be possible anymore. But at least it's a good idea. And I'm pretty sure that from now, maybe in 5 to 10 years, this might even become the standard. And the PCR might even be replaced by targeted sequencing. We will see how the technology further evolves. Another approach would be that you start with the screening test, or not a screening, a molecular WRD test from a WHO endorsed. For example, the GeneXpert, that's the one, or the BDMAX, sorry, the BDMAX, that's the one we used in our lab, which gives you a tiny little bit of leftover DNA solution. And this is then applied to targeted sequencing. And this allows you to indeed to perform the complete procedure from the diagnosis of TB until you get the complete resistome from the Ampor TB Oxford Nanopore assay within a single day. This is possibly because the ONT test only requires 2 hours, and 2 hours plus the library prep, plus the multiplex PCR after the BDMAX, which lasts 3 hours, and then 45 minutes for the bioinformatic analysis, gives you a complete working day starting from 8, and then you can leave the lab at 4:30 in the afternoon. The patient is still in the holding area of your emergency room. You give the diagnosis to the patient, you give him the treatment regimen, and you send him back home. You inform the family, and then the treatment can start under the surveillance of the regional public health center and of the family. Now, this is the DNA, the purified DNA in the BDMAX cartridge, and you see there 10 microliters, 7 to 10 microliters left over after the PCR is completed. And this can be used for downstream diagnostics, and the DNA is pure enough and the quality is high enough for ONT sequencing in most of the cases. Particularly, this is once again the timeline, but particularly when you guide the process by the CT value, you can even exclude unnecessary sequencing because of incomplete sequence reads or incomplete quality. We said, for example, that 12 antibiotics would be at least the number of antibiotics we expect from a successful sequencing. And with Oxford Nanopore, you get indeed sometimes report on 9, sometimes on 10, 11, 12 antibiotics. With the 12 antibiotics, we usually cover most of the important ones. And there are very, very few cases where important drugs were not reported. Most of the drugs that fall out of the sequencing are rifampicin and ethambutol. And rifampicin is anyway covered by the initial test, so that it's not of high importance anymore. And then you get here the field of the successful sequences. And on the other side, you get those fields where you would otherwise have performed the sequencing in vain because of incomplete sequence or low quality of sequencing. This leads to a slightly adjusted algorithm. You still start with the initial PCR, but then you look for the CT value of your, in this case, BDMAX, but could also be the Hein-Brucker genolyzed PCR, which also gives you purified DNA, or now the new PCR from Bioexin that also gives you a purified DNA. So you look for the CT value. When the CT value is below 28, then it's really worthwhile performing the Ampor test. When you get invalid targets in the Ampor test, then you can have this, what we observed, you can have problems with some resistance markers, particularly with rifampicin, where you have anyway the BDMAX result. With isoniazid, you have your BDMAX result. But for the fluoroquinolones, for example, you might use another test because those results can become questionable when you have a wild type. As long as you have a resistance marker, you can always trust the resistance markers. They were always true. You have, on the other side, a fully valid Ampor TB testing where all the drugs were completely reported with good quality. And then you can trust all results, report them back to the doctor without any limitation. Now, what do you need to consider when you set up your diagnostic algorithm? We mentioned most of the points. The risk of the patient to drop out is certainly one of the leading factors that you need to keep in mind when you decide how fast do you want to be with your diagnostics, and is it worth to have a one-day diagnostic algorithm, which leads then to the very last one that I proposed. There might be a strong surveillance program in your country which relies on whole genome sequencing data. Then you might rather go for whole genome sequencing. and not for the phenotypic DST, and you're at the algorithm from the European Reference Laboratory group around Daniela Cirillo and Andrea. You can maybe have special hospitalization rules and habits, which might also require very fast diagnostics because the doctors of the hospital want to get the results on the same day. The epidemiological framework needs to be kept in mind, particularly when it comes to high and low pre-XDR or XDR TB settings, the regional clustering of certain mutations, like, for example, the GCL10 in Eswatini, where you have not only a particular rifampicin resistance mutation, which is not detected by GeneXpert, but also very strongly associated RV0678 mutation, which leads to bedaquiline and clofazimine resistance. We have clinical demands, for example, available drugs and established treatment regimens. Do you regularly use BPAM? Do you regularly use the 9-month all oral? Do you still rely on 18-month regimens, or do you have so many XPR cases that you need to rather look in this direction? This is what you need to keep in mind when you decide whether you want to go for whole genome sequencing with a very meaningful and comprehensive testing or targeted sequencing, and whether you anyway need additional phenotypic DST. The laboratory needs or capacities need to be considered. Which molecular WRD do you have? Do you have a test like GeneXpert, which consumes a complete sample and you need a second sample? Then you anyway need a second encounter with the patient. Do you have how much of the NGS capacities do you have and which machine is available? And finally, the infrastructure of the laboratory is very important when it comes to IT landscape and when it comes to the reporting to the patient, because the reporting is key when it comes to speed. When you have a paper-based report, which can be lost, which is slow, which needs to be transported, you lose a lot of time that you might have gained in the laboratory with fast diagnostics. Very rapidly, which diagnostic tool might be good? This is another study from Rebecca Kuhlman from the Seek and Treat program or project. And you see here that the correlation of the success of sequencing is very strong with intensity indicators from GeneXpert. When you have a high positive GeneXpert result, both GenoScreen and Oxford Nanopore sequencing have almost complete blue lines, and blue lines means a very good quality of sequencing. Most of the drugs are covered. When you look in contrast in the very low positivity, then you have very short blue lines. And this correlates very much to our CT value that we use with the BDMAX. Very low means a high CT value. High CT value means very little TB DNA, and this means you get most likely not a good result. You might get better results with Oxford Nanopore than with GenoScreen, but this is just gradually. I think the key lesson learned from it is once you have a low positive result, you might not want to perform the targeted sequencing anymore, because the probability of incomplete or low quality results is so high that you might rather omit it. Otherwise, you're wasting a lot of resources, a lot of money, you're binding your stuff, and this for very, very poor quality of the output. While when you have a medium or low or high positivity in GeneXpert, then the sequencing might be reasonable. The only challenge is that the sputum that you used for the GeneXpert PCR is already gone, and you need a second sample, and the second sample might, of course, have another quality than the initial one. You can have much lower numbers of TB bacteria in the second sputum than in the first one. So the best approach would always be to use the DNA from the first sample for the sequencing instead of a second. Now, what is your information that you get in terms of the newer drugs? when you look at the publication, which is the same from Rebecca Coleman, actually, you see that the GenoScreen assay, the Dplex TB, had a very strong prediction power for beta-quilin and clofazimine, while it was extremely poor for the Oxford nanopore. In both cases, linezolid ranged around 50%, which is also not what we would expect, while in all the other drugs, both assays perform more or less equally well. So the prediction of resistance is good for most of the drugs, but was in this study poor for bedaquiline, linezolid, and clofazimine. This was, however, mostly because of the software version of Oxford Nanopore that the authors used. And the most recent review of the WHO, which was now using also the most recent pipeline offered by Oxford Nanopore, showed much better results with the same samples and the same sequencing, by the way. So they used the same sequences from the initial studies where they had those poor results, and then they got sensitivities for the prediction of resistance of over 70 or almost 75%. For bedaquiline, almost 70% for clofazimine, and almost 75% for linezolid, which means when you use the Oxford Nanopore, of course, you need to be sure that the most recent version of or release of the of the pipeline is used, which is, of course, nowadays not otherwise possible anymore. But this is also what you need to keep in mind when you look into studies and when maybe sales officers tell you something about the performance of the different assays. Those data were still affected by the software version that the authors used. Now, what are the differences? I think I don't need to go anymore in the details because Andrea did it so well. Just when it comes to the complexity of the assays, in our hands, we trained both Illumina and Oxford Nanopore. We established the Illumina in Kyrgyzstan and the Oxford Nanopore now in Uzbekistan, Kazakhstan, and Azerbaijan and Ukraine. And the training was much easier. The people understood the Oxford Nanopore much easier, and the hands-on time is also definitely lower than the hands-on time for the Illumina assay. Otherwise, it does not really make a big difference. The only thing is it's with a turnaround time, you can have results on the same day with targeted sequencing on Oxford Nanopore, usually within 2 hours, while you would usually take 1 or 2 days for the Illumina-based sequencing, which makes the Nanopore faster. Again, whether you need this speed depends very much on your diagnostic algorithm, the turnover and the throughput, and also finally with the high throughput, the price can be much better with Illumina. So when you have a very high number of samples that you need to sequence, the Illumina might be the better choice. The initial investment is nowadays, because nowadays the company Oxford Nanopore asks you to buy the grid iron, and this costs 50,000 euro on average. While the iSeq 100, the cheapest solution of Illumina, costs only around 16 to 20,000 US dollars, depending on the country. And it's almost maintenance-free, which means it very much depends also on your initial invest that you can make for the machine. Of course, Andrea already said it, when you have a cheap machine, the per assay price for consumables is higher than when you have a expensive machine. Usually you save on materials on the long run when you have a lot of sequences, when you rather invest in a more expensive machine in the beginning. Now, how can we use all the information that we get from the sequencing to guide the clinicians to make reasonable decisions on treatment? Now, this is the last chapter. And I start with the study that we performed in Kyrgyzstan. We all know how much effort we put during the Expand TB project 2010 to 2014 into the phenotypic DST. And it's now established everywhere in Central Asia, and every patient, really every patient, receives phenotypic DST unless they receive genome-based DST nowadays. And you see here, from a large cohort that we invested, all those cases with the resistances, so altogether we had 600 patients or a bit more included, and more than 200 of those had resistances to those drugs, which you see here on the left side. Those resistant drugs, or the drugs which were not effective, were included in the baseline treatment in 2/5 of cases, and 3/5 of cases did not have it in the baseline treatment. Of course, we can nobody blame to have it included, because the information of the resistance was not available when the doctor decided for the baseline treatment. But after 2 months, every doctor had received the phenotypic DST, and they could have decided, based on the phenotypic DST, which drug to take. And you see that in the majority of cases which had the resistant drugs in the baseline treatment, the doctors simply continued the regimen without any change. Those doctors who changed the treatment made the right decisions, but which was only about 2/5 of those cases. But even worse, some of the doctors who saw that the patient had a resistant drug in the baseline treatment had not a resistant drug in the baseline treatment. So they only had effective drugs in the baseline treatment. The doctors decided to include it in the regimen that they gave after 2 months. They changed the regimen sometimes because of intolerance or because the doctor had to be released and the drug was not available. And then they decided for a drug which was previously tested resistant. This means when you don't guide the doctors to use your results that you produce in the laboratory properly, you do a lot of work, you invest a lot of effort, but you are not sure that this ever leads to a good decision for the patient and a better treatment for the patient at the end. So we need to make a meaningful report to the doctor, which really guides the doctor towards the correct decisions. And the meaningful report includes, of course, all the basic information, the administrative information on the laboratory data, the patient data, the sample data, the order data, the submitted data. That's standard for every report. Then you should mention which type of sequencing you're performing, whether it's whole genome sequencing, targeted sequencing, and also which bioinformatic pipeline you used. Andrea already mentioned there are several pipelines on the market that you can use. When you use the profiler, you need to say, I used the profiler, and also which version of the profiler you use. And which reference database did you use, or the pipeline that you applied, which reference database did it use? Did it, for example, use the mutation catalog 2023, or does it already use the newest one, which will be released very soon, the 2026 mutation catalog? Then we have the quality metrics. We want to see the coverage, how much of the genome was covered, the variant calling threshold that you used. And when the QC fails, you definitely need to state that the results that you might still report are of limited quality, and then the doctor should discuss with you what to do with it and which decision to make on it. Of course, you will report the species that you identified, and whether it was clean or whether non-tuberculous mycobacteria have also been included. The lineage, the genotype might be important. For example, it could look like this: Mycobacterium tuberculosis, lineage 2, Central Asian outbreak clone. This might be a meaningful, complete characterization of the isolate that you have in front of you. And then you want to classify the resistance pattern, whether it's MDR or XDR or pre-XDR, so that the doctor really gets a clear wording for the type of resistance he's facing. Then you also want to report the mutations that you have found and how those are interpreted in line with the WHO recommendations. For example, when you have the RPOB S450L, you call it resistant and with a high confidence. And this is exactly what Andrea presented so well. According to the different categories of the catalog, you have a confidence that the WHO gives you, and you can say this is a high confidence mutation, this is a low confidence mutation, or this is completely uncertain, like here in the case of the fluoroquinolones, where you have the glycine 565 histidine mutation. Now, this is an example of a mutation which is a resistance inferred, which means, for example, when you have in the RV0678, which is a repressor gene, producing a repressor for the efflux pump, which pumps then the beta-acqualene out of the cell, which means when you have a non-functional repressor, the efflux pump will be overexpressed, and then you will have all the beta-acqualene being pumped out of the cell. When you have a deletion which leads to a truncation of the gene or a non-functional protein at the end, you will have, of course, a non-functional repressor, which means you have an overexpressed efflux pump, and this can lead, or this definitely leads to resistance, unless, and this is now a rare case, you have a compensatory mutation in the efflux pump. This is then, this mutation might not exist in your database yet because it might be unknown, but from what we know about the function of the gene, you as the expert in the laboratory needs to interpret it in this way, and even the pipeline might not tell it yet to you because the pipelines are always under development and might not yet even report it to you. For example, Profiler does not always give you the resistance inferred, but it tells you there is a polymorphism at this position, and then you need to interpret it in the right way and report it to the doctor. So the mutations and how the confidence level of the interpretation is classified, all this is important to the doctor, but also for yourself when you are called by the doctor and ask for consultation when it comes to the common decision how to treat the patient. And then what we do is we summarize the case at the end, and we give then a clear recommendation which regimen would be recommended and applied. For example, you can write, this is a 4-year-old boy with an MDR TB, pulmonary TB with evidence of resistance toward rifampicin, isoniazid low-level resistance, ethambutol, etionamide, proteonamide, and PAS. The MDR TB, anti-TB regimens that are recommended in such cases would be the 6-month BPARC, or the 6-month BLLDC regimen, the bedaquiline, linezolid, levofloxacin, delamanid, and plus minus clofazimine, or the 9-month all-oral bedaquiline, levofloxacin, clofazimine, pyrazinamide, high-dose isoniazid because of the low-dose mutation, plus linezolid or etionamide. This is, this regimen and not the BPAM is recommended because it's a 4-year-old boy. And this is also for the same reason preferred over BPAM or BPAM. Now, since this is quite a complex mechanism, you should consider integration or implementing a LIMS-based algorithm. So what we strongly recommend is to set up a laboratory information management system which not only accepts the data from the sequencing and receives the data by interface to the sequencing platform, it should also interpret the data with a reasonable algorithm in the LIMS, so that when this constellation occurs, which is usually a very simple if-then thing that you can establish even in Excel, when this constellation of resistances occurs, then this treatment is recommended. And this should include the age of the patient, then the resistance markers, and the and also the resistance constellations. This will be a lot of work in the beginning, but it's definitely worthwhile and saves you a lot of time at the end, and gives very strong results to the clinician. And then you won't have such a chaos that we observed with the phenotypic DST, because the clinicians would be guided how to interpret the results and how to make proper decisions based on it. This will then lead to a very streamlined algorithm from the sample to the MWRD, over targeted sequencing to the LIMS, the structured reporting with the interpretation and recommendations, and then the real-time reporting to the doctor through electronic reporting mechanisms. And with this, you can have it within 1 day, but at least with a much shorter time than with the established phenotypic algorithms. With this, we come to the key conclusions. Rapid diagnostics has an important impact on TB management. Targeted sequencing reduces the time to inform treatment regimen selection by more than 2 weeks on average. But the direct evidence on the impact of targeted sequencing on morbidity and treatment outcome is still missing. We only have indirect evidence, and this is multifold, but still of moderate quality. Ultra-fast diagnostic workflow is established with molecular WRDs and ONT for TB diagnostics and the complete resistome in a single day from a single sample, so there's no second encounter of the patient needed. This would reduce this problem with the dropout of patients and the loss of follow-up. The weakness of targeted sequencing sensitivity, particularly of ONT in detecting beta-catenin and clofazimine-resistant markers, is still an issue. But when you consider the time that you gain through the increased speed of diagnostics, this loss of quality will be, I think, compensated by the gain of speed. PCR-CT values should be used to guide your your TNGS decision to avoid unnecessary loss of resources by failing tests, because then you can be sure that your sequencing will give you a meaningful and high-quality result. And the diagnostic algorithms are available and need to be adjusted to your local needs and capacities. I recommend that you consult one of your SRL partners, or Andrea or me, when you have questions regarding your local situation. And I think at least we are, of course, of help, but as far as I know, Andrea, he will be also happy to help you. Use of LIMS-based electronic support for reporting is highly recommended to accelerate transmission of the results to the doctor and also to guide him to make the right decisions based on it. With this, I thank all the partners that helped us or used to help us, because one of the partners doesn't exist anymore. It's trumped away. And with this, I also thank you for all your interest and look forward to questions.
Muito obrigada, pela sua exposição. Eu gostaria de apresentar brevemente a doutora Daniela Cirilo. Doutora Daniela também chefia um laboratório de referência supranacional da OMS, que está situado em Milão, Itália, onde também está vinculado o doutor Andrea Khabib, e ela tem uma grande experiência no apoio ao diagnóstico de tuberculose da resistência a fármacos para vários países, incluindo países de baixa renda. Doutora Daniela, eu agradeço muito a sua participação, gostaria de ouvir seus comentários sobre as recomendações que foram expostas, as guias, né, para um uso racional dessa tecnologia, considerando países que possuem grandes dificuldades econômicas, né, com recursos muito limitados para o uso dessas tecnologias.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm very happy to be able to participate in to this very, very interesting seminar. And I think that Dr. Kabibe and Dr. Hoffman have already made a lot of the key points. If I needed to add something, I understand that next generation sequencing is very appealing, is a good technology, but the current assays are still very far from giving us the answers that we want. So in countries where there is the possibility to implement NGS, there is also the possibility to implement WGS, so whole genome sequencing. And it is true that some days matters for providing the proper regimen, but you know, having a higher level result will allow you to really move on with the regimen that is adequate for the people. And the reason why I'm saying so is because the cost of targeted NGS is not trivial. Actually, targeted NGS is more expensive than WGS in general. And what I recommend is always to perform WGS in centers that are able to perform several runs per week. So you do not have a long delay. And how is this doable? It is doable having centers that can combine TB and MDR, because we are not only performing WGS for tuberculosis, but we are also performing WGS for other pathogens. And they can be run on the same run. So we need really to move out from the paradigm that we need to have TB done in the TB laboratory from the beginning to the end. Said so, of course, that needs to be adapted, and the algorithm that Harald has shown is very, very interesting, but you need to be ready to run targeted NGS for a few samples. You know, you need to run that for a single samples, because if you are waiting for the second one, then it becomes really, at the end, too late, or you are going to invest a lot of money. The other additional advantage that you can have with WGS is that you can have cluster analysis done. And this is, if I can look at the future, I would say that the future is a platform that from the sample will allow to perform WGS. So you will have information on all the mutation, not only some genes that are included in the target reaction, and you can have information on the possibility to identify clusters and transmission. This would be the ideal assay. Of course, the cost needs to be discussed. The cost may be higher, or somehow with the technology may become lower. Why I'm saying that the targeted NGS right now is not ideal? It's not ideal because if we are looking at drug-sensitive TB, then we have cheaper way to test for isoniazid rifampin. So what we are recommending in Europe now is to have the initial test that is screening for rifampicin and isoniazid resistance. Why? Because isoniazid resistance is way more frequent than rifampicin resistance. After that, what are we interested at fluoroquinolones? And again, we can have assays that can give us that easily. Sorry about that. And the point is that once we have identified the rifampicin-resistant case, culture will need to be done, because we cannot put all our hope on the targeted NGS. We know that bedaquiline resistance is linked. The current assay have only RV067A. That is the regulator, is the negative regulator of the efflux pump. We need to know, to have information in order to be precise. We need to have the whole sequence of that gene, and then we need to have the sequences of the two components of the pump. Because we know that if one of the two components is mutated, and this is a story that is seen frequently in South America, not in Brazil, but in other countries, then even the identification of mutation on RV0678 may not be relevant, because if you don't have the pump, having a negative repressor that is not working doesn't make any sense. I mean, doesn't change anything. I would say that the strain can even be more susceptible than normal. The other thing is we need to have other genes, because we now have a regimen that is called BPAL or BPALM. That is what we are using. But this comes as a brand. So you cannot use bedaquiline, you cannot remove people from BPAL, remove bedaquiline, use pretomamide and linezolid together. This is not recommended right now. So are we taking the responsibility just based on that to remove people from BPALM? We may be removing too many people at the end. And that is also a risk, because when you are dropping bedaquiline with the current drugs that we have for MDR treatment, we are really moving out from shorter regimen, moving towards older regimen, more toxic and with additional problems. So we need to be sure. In order to do that, certainly the sequence of RV0678 is a very good proxy. The point is you need to have the strain, because what is recommended then is to have a phenotypic DST. And for phenotypic DST now, one of the good tools that is becoming available are the microtiter plates, where you can have an idea of the presence of mutation, increase of MIC, or maybe you don't see the MIC that is really moving. And that is much better than testing at a single concentration imaging. The other thing is regimens are moving very fast, and it takes a lot of time to adapt the targeted NGS commercial assays to the identification of what could be the new targets. So having information on the all genomes will allow you to interpret. So then we will be just moving into the second part. So the interpretation of the data, and then it's a great idea to link the interpretation of the data to the list of the laboratory, transmitting automatically the report and make them fastly available. So I think, just to make the story short, is targeted NGS, wonderful tool, especially where you have a lot of MDR. If you do not have a lot of MDR, then maybe not, because it's going to cost you either you go for a routine targeted NGS and you use it instead of the other test as initial test, but I'm afraid that you will lose all the Pauci bacillari specimen, because right now, no matter what, we have the sensitivity is higher, definitely higher than expert, ultra, and even higher than BMAX and of the other assays. The ideal is to be able to, in countries where there is a culture established, then certainly upfront molecular diagnostic, culture, from culture, not midget, that is extremely expensive, but maybe WGS. If you have all sensitive, stop there, you know that is sensitive. If you have some phenotypic, the genotypic resistance, then maybe MIC is going to give you more information, and then you need to proceed with that. If where you have, like Harald is working a lot with Eastern European countries and former Soviet Union Republic, there is a different story, but I think it's a different story also from your epidemiology. And there, sure, I mean, they see a lot, they need to start screening somehow. But you need to consider that we still have some problem with the current assay. We put a lot of hope, I don't know if Andrea has shown that, on the extra large GenoScreen assay, or that assay had a lot of genes, much more. But consider that if the drugs that are now in phase 2B trial will become available even for compassionate use, as they are proposing now, then you need to have additional determinant. And you can look at those determinants by WGS, but before targeted NGS will incorporate those will be many years. Those are my comments. And I enjoyed very much the talk of my colleagues, I must say so. Wonderful. And also congratulations to you that are putting together, this very interesting seminar.
I'm very happy to have you here to discuss this very important topic. Dr. Harold would like to comment on what Daniela has just brought up.
I mean, I can only fully agree with what Daniela said. Of course, I mean, she is such an excellent expert in this field. And of course, what I presented is very much biased by our glasses and lenses from Central Asia, because that's where we work, and Eastern Europe, Ukraine, Belarus, Azerbaijan, Central Asia, those are our partner countries. So of course, that's not directly transferable to the situation in Africa, Southeast Asia, or South America. But that's what I meant when I said we need to look into your situation. And when you come up, or when you plan your diagnostic algorithm, you should definitely consider all these different points that I listed, and then consult with experts like Daniela, Andrea, me, or others, in order to get a better understanding what is possible, what is reasonable, what is also cost effective in your proper situation, to give you the best information for the most optimized effort in order to prevent the loss of resources.
Thank you. We have a question from our audience. They ask, how reliable is phenotypic DST for BPAL regimen drugs using the critical concentrations on MGAT established by the WHO?
Yes, okay. So the critical concentration has been established in midget and is 4-time dilution compared to the broad microdilution. There is I don't know if you know, but the UCAST, that is the authority that in Europe provides the standard for EMA, that is our equivalent of the FDA for bacterial resistance, as establish a protocol for testing mycobacteria and tuberculosis. And that protocol is agnostic, is a broad microdilution, and is agnostic of the method. So in theory, all the commercial method should be validated against this standard protocol. This protocol is too time consuming, too complicated, to be adopted in the clinical routine, but should be used as a standard and should be used to establish ECOF for new drugs when they come out. Said so, there was an attempt to calibrate MIGIT versus the UCAST method, and the results are not yet publicly available. The MIGIT tube can trap protein in the tube, and this is why you need to increase the concentration of the drug in some cases. So that could be a problem. But anyway, the WHO has established the critical concentration as a tentative critical concentration for now. Said so, if you test by MIGIT and then you compare the MIGIT results with the mutation in RV0678, you may not find a complete correspondence. Why? Because we are looking at lower level mutation due to the function of the pumps. And what you may see is just an increase in MIC. And this increase in MIC would be captured if you test at least at 3 concentration in MIGIT. Because if your ECOF, if your MIC for that particular mutation is exactly at the critical concentration, and you repeat the test 3 times, you will have 2 times sensitive, 1 resistance, 2 times resistant, 1 sensitive, because it's really like throwing a coin and be a little bit on the right, or a little bit on the left. So this is the problem of MIGIT. And this is one of the reasons why we hope that commercial plates that are much more handy compared to the UCAST broad microdilution could become available commercially. It could be used in those cases. They will allow to test for 12 drugs, including protomanid and delamanid right now. The only drugs that really is so and so on the first evaluation is cycloserine. That didn't give a great result so far.
Regarding also, I'm sorry.
No, maybe Daniela, you can also elaborate a bit on the protomanid, the 2 concentrations recommended in phenotypic testing.
Okay, the 2 concentration of protomanid is something that requires a bigger elaboration. And I tell you why. Because for protomanid, the 2 concentration were proposed, 0.5 and 2. And what is the problem there? The problem is that without mutations, so we are not talking about mutation in these cases, we have 2 different distributions for all the human lineages and lineage 1. So lineage 1 is a critical concentration that is higher than all the other lineages. So and for this reason, they have established 2 different concentrations, right? And at this point, we don't know how much that will matter clinically speaking, because what was missing was the fact that not sufficient data were recovered in trials from countries where lineage 1 was prevalent. So this is what they are going to look after at this point. Because if they show that lineage 1 TB responded to BPAL in the same way, then there is no problem in really discussing this issue, because you can consider up to 2 sensitive and then over-resistant, right? If this is not the case, or you cannot reach the concentration, the plasmatic concentration that correspond to the higher MIC for lineage 1, then that's another story. Then you need to know the lineage up front. So you test at 0.5, and then if you are resistant at 0.5 and you are not a lineage 1, you are resistant. If you are at a 0.5 resistant, but you are a lineage 1, you need to look if you are resistant at 2, and you need to be over 2, because this is the normal distribution for lineage 1. Again, on a microtiter plate is easier.
Very good.
But maybe Daniela, correct me when I'm wrong, but when you say you are resistant, you mean you are above the threshold which is defined as the resistance threshold, which means the ECOF, which is not yet translating into treatment failure, because the data for this, the clinical data.
Over 2 is translated to treatment failure.
Exactly, but not 0.5, which is then
exactly. But this is a subtle distinction, and this is very true. But if you are moving a lineage 1, not a lineage 1 or a lineage non-1, and you can see that epidemiologically you have a shift toward the right. So from 0.25, and then you are moving towards 2, then you have a shift toward resistance in the MIC, because you may still treat the person, but you are something is happening in the distribution. So at this point, you are looking at the same phenomenon that we saw with 0678 with bedaquiline. That was a shift toward the right.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you. I would like to raise a little of our concerns. As you have presented, we have less representation of sequenced genomes. For instance, here in Latin America and in other countries that also have more difficulties in applying these technologies, and that how could that impact on such decisions about resistance, as you have just pointed this example for lineage 1?
By the way, if you are using targeted sequencing, will identify correctly the lineages. Said so, I'm not sure that you will implement targeted sequencing universally, but for some drug-resistant strains, I would suggest that some sequencing is done. And, it's really, even in Latin America, there was a huge capacity supported during COVID to provide sequences. So the point is to try to work on that, to build on that. And again, I think AMR, the cost of sequencing in my laboratory is lower than the cost of a DST imaging. So it becomes a technical issues. It becomes, referral. We all agree that you cannot decentralize sequencing. I would never recommend to decentralize sequencing for different reasons. You may not have enough workload to justify that. So sequencing, but needs to be somehow centralized.
Yeah, but of course, this matters with the prices that are available in the regions. And we know that in Latin America, many countries in Latin America do not have access to discounted prices for several tests and technologies. This is an issue. I know that there is capacity for sequencing at a central level, at least in Chile, Argentina, Mexico. They are establishing this kind of capacity.
Also in Brazil.
Brazil, of course. But it's true that to have it implemented effectively, you need also to have access to the samples from the country. So the referral system is a very important point that Daniela mentioned, and it's crucial to receive the samples on time. And of course, to have at least a budget to cover the sequencing testing of those samples with drug resistance and important drug resistance.
Exactly. Yes. And, you know, it needs to be looked very carefully with the NTP. You have an excellent NTP manager in Brazil. Fernanda is excellent. And, you know, I mean, what works? If you ask me what works, I would answer what works in your country. This is what works, depending what you want to achieve. I mean, if you have 2% drug-resistant TB, then I would not invest a huge amount of money into that. I will try, you know, to be sure that you are not losing cases. If you have a lot of, you know, non-symptomatic people that are triggering the disease, again, those people, you really need to find other strategies to find cases. But
we have a trade-off between the centralization of the results and the logistic constraints also. But for certain, we do have this strategy based on reference laboratories that will need to implement that for a number of states. Brazil is huge, so it's really an issue. Dr. Carla, would you like to comment a little bit about this implementation within the Reviget network?
Primeiro, eu quero reforçar a excelência das informações passadas, da discussão. Foi muito engrandecedor, né? Concordo plenamente com a gente precisa que os fluxos sejam adequados à nossa realidade, e concordo também com a doutora Daniela. Daniela Cirilo, quando fala que não é a favor da descentralização, mas a gente precisa, em um país continental como o nosso, ter pontos, né, de centralização, onde a gente possa agilizar o resultado. E quando a gente olha nos nossos estados, né, o Pará é imenso, ele já é continental, o Amazonas também, e a gente tem uma dificuldade muito grande aí no transporte de amostras, então a gente precisa, em alguns estados, ter pontos que facilitem essa coleta e esse fluxo, para que a gente possa chegar ao que mais interessa, que é o atendimento, o tratamento precoce, queda da cadeia de transmissão e qualidade, dar mais qualidade de vida às pessoas que precisam. Eu estou muito satisfeita, muito obrigada, muito orgulhosa e honrada da disponibilidade de todos vocês nessa banca. Eu espero que a gente se encontre em breve no ESLI, né, doutora Daniela? Muito obrigada.
Thank you. No, certainly we will meet in Rio in November, I guess. And that would be fantastic. And, you know, I agree with you. I mean, you cannot compare Brazil to Italy, to Malta, to the Netherlands, to Sweden. You know, we are talking about different order of magnitude in terms of the problem, the people, but not even to the Central Asian Republic, because there are two things. it's the size of the country and also the extreme differences between the regions in the country. I know Brazil a little bit, so I also know what the challenges are. And you have some states where something would work, and you have some states where the same thing is not going to work, most likely. And you need to adapt to that. But we also have the South and the North. So what we can implement in Milano cannot be implemented in other region or in other town or in other places. It needs to be adaptable. And of course, if we are talking about sophisticated technology, because no matter what, we are not talking about viruses, and the viruses with the Oxford nanopore, the old format, you could go in the middle of the bush with a portable computer and then do the sequence. That is what they have done in Central Africa. But those are viruses. I mean, it's a different story. Here we are talking about nasty bacteria coming from sputum. Is different. It's different in the manipulation, in the extraction, in the preparation. So there is some difficulties and challenges. But you need to know your epidemiology, because if you don't have MDR-TB and you don't have bedaquiline resistance, then we are not shooting with a large gun to mosquitoes. You may have other technology. Now there is the close to point of care technology. You just dip the swab in a sputum cup, and then you have a test that tells you is TB or not TB. Then you take that sample, and certainly if you are expecting 0 MDR, then you can stop like that and start with the treatment. If you have more than that, then you need to refer the sputum sample somewhere else and do at least rifampicin and isoniazid. But everything should be tailored to your capacity, your epidemiology, and the feasibility. Because when we are talking about, a lot of millions of people, then we are talking about something else. In the Netherlands, they know everything, name by name. They know everything about all the cases of TB. But we don't know that in Germany, and we don't know that in Italy, we do not know that in France. It's just a system that works differently, and the number of cases is different, and the number of people is different, and the number of laboratories is different. We are spread out. Even in Italy, we are too spread out to centralize a lot. But this technology needs to be centralized, period. Otherwise, it won't work.
Just to clarify one thing from the studies that have been released on cost modeling analysis for TNGS use, is the fact that centralization that is recommended does not necessarily mean one laboratory. It means testing done at central level, reference level. But of course, this depends on the country. Some countries are bigger, have heavier burden of drug-resistant TB. So in some settings, this means 1, 2, 3 reference laboratories that are in the country. So it's not necessarily a single one, but of course are those central. There are minimum requirements for sequencing. This is capacity, staff, throughput. So there is need for volume of samples that are received by the lab to have regular runs. Otherwise, it's not cost effective, and capacity for IT and data analysis. These are minimum requirements. And these requirements are usually satisfied at country level by very few laboratories that are those more central, more specialized.
I would like to comment a little bit on what laboratories nowadays make successful. And when you look at the big companies, LabCorp, Quest, Sonic Healthcare, the worldwide acting laboratory companies, which are really successful, have 6, 7, or even more than $10 billion turnover per year. They're not successful because they are doing such a wonderful job in the laboratory, because that's where what more or less is done always on the same level. Of course, when it comes to such highly specialized analyzers like sequencing, you definitely have differences, but the laboratory services are so standardized nowadays. What makes them successful is logistics. The laboratory companies, the successful laboratory companies are 50% logistics companies. And in order to become successful, you need to establish very strong logistics systems. That's what we convinced USAID about. And then we established a new logistics system in Uzbekistan based on computer-controlled routes implemented with ArcGIS. They're still using it, and they're now covering the whole country with regular 2-weekly logistics. Now, when it comes to Brazil, of course, you need to include also flight services. You need to it's very challenging in such a country, but that's what makes it successful. And only when you consider we receive samples from Saudi Arabia every day we receive samples from Saudi Arabia. All the samples which come through SYNLAB go to our lab. They collect the samples at 10 o'clock in the morning. They bring it to the airport at 1 o'clock. At 1 o'clock at night, it's delivered at our laboratory. In the next morning, we do the processing of the samples, and at 3 o'clock, the doctor has the results on its screen. That's it's possible, and the distance between Saudi Arabia and Gauteng is also probably not larger than between Recife and Rio de Janeiro. I want to say it's possible, but it's challenging, of course, and you need to include whatever is possible to make the logistics effective. But then you can be really successful.
This is great insight, really, that we
I
should.
fully agree, Harold. I fully agree. Those are companies that saw the business, and the business is how to move samples and centralize samples, because the more is less. Of course, more for biochemistry. I mean, microbiology is sometimes a little bit more sophisticated, but in general, it is the winner. The strong logistic is what guarantee the turnaround time. You can be as good as you want, but then if it takes 3 days or 1 week to move a sample, forget it.
Yeah.
Yes. We have a question for Dr. Kabibi, Andrea. We have a question about your figure 1, where the brief results, they question if they include the susceptible cases, and whether the differences from fluoroquinolone results could be due to the fact that the fluoroquinolones could have been tested only in RIF-resistant isolates.
Yeah, I assume this refers to the WHO data that I showed and the testing coverage. But yes, the testing coverage for rifampicin applies to the whole populations. Of course, RIF susceptible and RIF resistant. Whether the fluoroquinolone resistant testing coverage data are referred only to the RIF resistant population. And I expect, of course, the coverage on RIF susceptible population to be extremely poor for fluoroquinolone resistance testing. And so that will be even more limited, unless, I mean, in the surveys, this is covered, but I don't think that in the diagnostics, I mean, fluoroquinolones is not usually tested if you are susceptible to the first-line drugs.
One last comment I would like to raise is when we think of the laboratory setting that you need to have in order to make these results available, the logistics that has been brought up also that needs to be taken into account to make these tests cost effective. Do you have experiences about the association of these networks with the social support. I was wondering about the explanation of Dr. Harold on how we need to keep the patient in sight so that he can be diagnosed and rapidly forwarded to treatment. How is this being thought of in the context of these increasing availability of better tools to diagnose, but those possible constraints on how to apply them in the best way so that it can serve the patient?
Is this a question to me? Well, of course, you cannot force a patient to stay, but you can, of course, recommend him to wait for the laboratory results. And as long as they come quickly, you might still have access to the patient. I mean, it's a big challenge that patients drop out and are lost to follow-up. But as Daniela said, it's certainly not possible to establish in every health center a one-day TB diagnostics. This is something for big centers where you anyway have the sequencing on a regular basis performed because they have the samples there, etc. So when you have, for example, a regional hub in Brazil where you decide to establish the sequencing and you do it on a more or less daily basis for not only TB, for other reasons as well, for viruses, for other multi-drug resistant bacteria, not only TB, then there you have an everyday chance to sequence, and you can really let the patient wait for the results. And that's where it might be applicable. It might not be applicable on the countryside at the rural health cost, for sure not. So all these algorithms, I think that's the key message. All these algorithms are not one size fits all. They all need to be adjusted on the local situation, on the country need, on the capacities in the laboratories, etc. And for this, I would highly recommend to adjust for consultation from experts in the field who have a lot of sequencing implemented in their partner countries, in their own laboratory, because that's something they're definitely happy to share, and which assures at the end a meaningful outcome for the patients and a better patient management.
And if I may add, you need also to link the diagnostic process to the overall management of the patients. Because if then the patients are admitted in the hospital or they live nearby, then you may not want to keep the patients for 7 hours in front of your door. You may send them at home and say, you know, you have the results. One thing that is important to remember is that the key point is the accessibility of the patients. This need to retain the patient comes from the fact that some of those people are investing a lot of money to reach the clinic. But and they may not come back, or they may not want to come back, or they may not have the money to come back. But if you are referring the person somewhere else for a treatment, then you don't need to keep him outside the door because you are transferring to another center anyway. Or if the person lives in town, and we are talking about cities, then again, it's not worth. Or you have or the infectious disease specialists are going to start the MDR treatment after a series of tests, then again, you need to readjust that. So it's really needed to be adjusted also to the clinical management that comes after. Consider that even for the family, the person that comes with TB, the people in the family that he had to infect has done that already, because he was in his setting until the minutes before. So sometimes they tell me, but they have children. Oh yeah, but they had children, sure. So we want to start the treatment as soon as possible, but at this point, overnight doesn't change anything. You can tell him to use a mask and to start protecting the others. The key point is to retain is the fact that is this person reliable and is coming back, and I can still have access to him or she or her, or I'm losing. So this is my only chance to start a treatment. So also, this is an aspect that I think is relevant. And again, it comes with the population, the epidemiology in your country, and a lot of other issues. But the logistic is key. Harald is 100% right.
And to close the circle, also the communication of the results, because sometimes the results sit, in particular those from sequencing that are a bit complicated, they are not entered into systems readily, they don't reach back the hospital. So that is also a part that, as Harald mentioned, needs to be improved with very good electronical links. And it's, I see in general, this is still a missing point, suboptimal point for NGS implementations in any systems that I'm seeing in several countries.
Of course. Dr. Carla would like to make the final comments for this session that has been so really wonderful. Really, we had a lot of insights from this presentations, and we are very happy to have your expertise here to discuss this. But unfortunately, we need to come to the end of the session, and for sure there will be other opportunities for us to gather and to have more conversations on that.
Latest in Rio.
Yes, yes.
A gente parece que vai ter que continuar nessa discussão em outro momento por conta do avançar da hora. Estou refletindo ainda aqui os desafios da implantação do WGS e desse retorno ao paciente em um período de tempo mais curto possível, mas ainda temos muito a avançar. Eu só agradeço a todos mais uma vez a disponibilidade dessa mesa maravilhosa aqui, né? São os melhores. Doutora Daniela Civil, muito obrigada. Doutora André, doutor Harold, doutora Theolis, muito obrigada. E a todos os ouvintes aqui, os participantes online, que são muitos, e eu fico muito feliz com esse interesse, né? Há uma busca por esse conhecimento, por essa discussão no Brasil também. Nós temos aí participantes de diversas regiões. Muito obrigada a todos.
Okay, I would like to thank you all, thank the audience, and we finish this session. I would just like to make a short comment. This session has also been organized in concert with the National Institute of Health of Moçambique, and I thank very much Dr. Celso Khosa for intermediating these successful meeting that we have just had. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye. Thanks, everybody.
See you in Brazil. Bye.
For sure.
Bye-bye. Thank you very much.
Thanks.
Bye-bye.